Spain's economy is booming, with its growth outperforming other major European countries. Tourism, public investment and harnessing immigration to boost its labour force have all contributed. But can Spain's economic boom really last? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Spain was ranked as the world's best performing economy in 2024 by the British magazine, The Economist. Its growth is ahead of European neighbours like Germany, France and Italy. So, what's behind Spain's economic success?
Spain's economy has grabbed headlines recently, described as booming and the envy of Europe. How has Spain done so well, while most of Europe is economically slowing down? Last year, the country's gross domestic product grew by 3.2%. Its neighbours are behind, with France's growing by 1.1%, and Italy's by only 0.5%. Meanwhile, Germany's economy shrank by 0.2%.
Si nuestra economía crece,
if our economy is growing, and today it's growing 4 times faster than the European average, while reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, it is thanks to a transformation of our economic model.
Que tiene en Teresa Rivera a una de sus señas de identidad.
Economists are putting the figures down to an increase in tourism and immigration. A record 94 million people visited Spain in 2024. It's now competing with France, which saw 100 million. While Spain's recent immigration reform has eased the pathway for foreign workers to gain residency and work permits, boosting the country's workforce. But behind the headlines lies a more complicated picture. Spanish unemployment is over 10%, the highest in the European Union, and its debt-to-GDP ratio is the 4th highest in the Eurozone. Spaniards will be hoping the economic sunshine will be here to stay, as the country is not out of the water quite yet.
Well, let's meet our guests. I'm delighted to say, joining me in the studio, we have Nina dos Santos. She's a journalist and host of the podcast Control Alt Deceit. In London, Lorenzo Codogno, he's a visiting professor at the London School of Economics and the former chief economist at the Italian Treasury. And in Houston, Texas, in the United States, we have Pablo Calderon Martinez. He is associate professor in politics and international relations at Northeastern University, London. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Nina, to you first. A staggering statistic, 40% of all growth in the Eurozone last year came from Spain. I mean, they're smashing it.
Absolutely. I saw that statistic recently as well, and I blinked and had to sort of second check it because I almost couldn't believe it, considering as this is a country that I covered about 10, 15 years ago when it was on the brink of a bailout that famously Spain's government at the time said wasn't a bailout. A rescate que no era un rescate, as you'd say in Spanish. But it's amazing how they've turned things around. A lot of that has to do with tourism. It has to do with getting more investment from the EU and trying to rebuild the country's economy very quickly after COVID via controversially migration.
Pablo, to you, I mean, a lot of European leaders will be looking at Spain and they will be very envious.
Absolutely. I think the fact that the economy rebounded so quickly after the pandemic, and the fact that the numbers are staggering, really, and the amount of growth that Spain has managed to succeed over the last couple of years is really impressive. But again, it's a matter of about it being sustainable, and again, the causes for the economic growth and what has led to this big economic growth. And it's not the first time we've seen the Spanish economy grow, and then everything ends up in tears, right? It's tended to be a very sort of boom and bust economy, basically since the 1970s, 1960s. So we'll have to wait and see if this is sustainable and this can be maintained over the long term.
Lorenzo, as an economist looking in and being Italian, are you envious of the Spanish?
Well, of course, we are all envy of the Spanish because they are posting very high growth right now. However, you have to put things into prospect. I think if we look back at the situation when COVID hit, the Spanish economy was hit very hard. Actually, in 2020, GDP contracted by almost 11 percentage points. It was 9 percentage point contraction in Italy. Since then, the Spanish economy at the beginning struggled to recover. And there was a very simple reason for that. Spain has a big chunk of the economy which is linked to the so-called high contact industries. So basically restaurants, hotels, and retail trade and so forth, which suffered tremendously during the COVID period. Then following COVID, the Spanish economy recovered rapidly. But it took many years, actually up until 2023, to catch up with Italy. Catching up with Italy was not enough, clearly. Spain continued to grow at a very strong pace, while in the other countries started to slow. And that's the reason why Spain is doing so well right now. It is actually exposed to the right sectors, the right industries, still has a very booming labor market, and it's less affected by some of the shocks that are troubling core European countries at the moment.
Nina, to you, 94 million visitors to Spain last year. I know there's always been a bedrock of tourism and a flow of money inwards from people who love going to Spain. But it's not just tourism now, is it? They've moved into other sectors.
That's right, but those tourism figures are amazing. Again, considering as France is the most visited country in the world and it attracts 100 million, so they're not far off. And those are the numbers you're quoting for 2024. It's likely that there's going to be more than 94 million people visiting Spain probably in 2025, including people who are armed with a strong dollar. We've had a lot of Americans deciding to move to Spain. There's also been the lure of wealth tourism in terms of good tax deals, golden visas, and so on and so forth. Italy, for instance, is starting to implement sort of similar procedures. When you look at other countries, like, for instance, the UK, which has managed to get itself into a bit of a rut in terms of cutting back on investment to balance budgets consistently, I suppose Spain is taking a very different approach here. The big risk, though, is that it does still have a large amount of debt. Just away from the issue of tourism that you and Lorenzo were just talking about, the other thing that Spain's been really successful in is green energy. So it's invested hugely in green energy, and that's helped it to weather the storm coming from the war in Ukraine, which obviously saw energy costs really rise. And now Europe's going to be buffeted by double-digit trade tariffs from Trump, and Spain is exporting a lot more services rather than goods at the moment.
And just tell me, Keir Starmer in the UK, he could only dream of this kind of growth.
Yes, that's right, but he also wouldn't dream of an unemployment rate that's the best since 2008 for Spain, that is still in the double digits. It's 10.8%. That would be completely unacceptable for an economy like the United Kingdom. So, you know, I suppose it's 6 2/3, I suppose.
Pablo, to you, we've seen a lot of political upheaval over the last couple of years in your home country. Pedro Sanchez seems to have negotiated it all very skillfully.
Yeah, that's true, and this is the clear, perhaps contradicts the famous argument about being the economy, right? And it's all about the economy, right? So Spain has done very well in terms of economic performance, economic growth, weathering the storm from high inflation following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, following the pandemic. But that hasn't meant that Pedro Sanchez has been exempt from political upheaval and political troubles. A lot of it has to do, and we've talked about this before, somehow paradoxically, with actually the influx of tourism, and there's a lot of social discontent and the feelings starting to turn against tourism in certain places a little bit. So, certainly there's been a lot of political upheaval, a lot of political problems, but the one thing that helped Pedro Sanchez, and the one thing that the political opponents of Pedro Sanchez cannot challenge him on, is precisely the economy. So that's why politics in Spain has shifted a little bit more towards social issues, culture wars, nationalisms, that sort of things, because the economy really at this moment in time is the one thing that I suppose is keeping the socialist government afloat.
Lorenzo, in your experience as an economist, are these kind of numbers sustainable in the long term?
Well, 3% plus is not sustainable for Spain, but so Spain has a higher potential growth than most other Eurozone and EU countries. So I would say that in the near term, at least, Spain will continue to overperform, if only because there is still slack in the labor market. There is increasing participation in the labor market, so growing labor force, so supply side story that is positive here, including immigration that is somewhat higher than in other countries. Again, the mix of value added and industries in the country is favorable right now, given that industry is in recession globally and it will be under pressure in Europe, especially following Trump's tariffs. So there is a deep problem there, and Spain is less exposed to that. It is also less exposed to high energy prices. So all in all, I think Spain will slow down, but will continue to overperform the rest of Europe.
So Nina, do you think we're entering a period of a golden age for Spain, as it were, if this kind of growth is in the short term sustainable?
Economically, as Pablo was just saying, but perhaps not politically, because Pedro Sanchez has been in government for quite some time. He has a minority government. He has to govern with Catalan separatists, and there's a lot of people in other parts of Spain who totally disagree with that strategy. And the other thing is that he is actually, in terms of the geopolitical direction of his government, he's a bit of an outlier in terms of the EU in general, because the EU has been moving further and further towards the centre-right. And so the levers of power in places like Germany now are firmly centre-right, whereas Pedro Sanchez has this minority government that he has to rely upon separatists to govern with, which means that he wouldn't really have the numbers to push through really substantial economic reforms. So it's ticking along nicely for now, but as Lorenzo was just pointing out, it won't last forever.
Pablo, talk to us about the housing crisis, because a lot of very educated young Spanish people are moving overseas because they want to buy property and they feel that's something that's just not available to them at home in Spain.
Yeah, that's something that historically has happened in Spain, right? Spain has always had a lot of emigration. Right now it's having a lot more immigration as well, but Spanish immigration historically has been a little bit peculiar because Spanish people that emigrate tend to return back to Spain as well. So it's not that this permanent migration in many ways. And that's something that we've seen in Spain since the 1950s and 1960s. But yeah, in reality, we are seeing a lot of people leaving, and we do have a housing crisis that is, again, paradoxically exacerbated by the very same thing that is fueling this big economic boom, which is tourism, which of course, as we know, makes house prices rise and makes everything more expensive, and is helping to this sort of cost of living crisis for the people that live in Spain and for Spanish locals. So the housing crisis is one of the big problems, and I think it's probably going to be the undoing of the Spanish government, because if they don't fix it soon and if they don't start to see some results there, I think that's going to create very big political problems for the Spanish government. I don't think there's many alternatives coming from the opposition parties at the moment, but as we know, opposition parties don't really have to come with strategies. All they have to do is have good lines of attack, and I think there's a very good line of attack there in terms of, despite the good economic performance, as Nina was saying, the very high levels of unemployment that are still double digits for Spain, and they are even higher for youth unemployment in certain parts of Spain, getting to over 20%, and the housing crisis, which means young people are, to a great extent, and we've seen this happening across Europe as well, they're starting to desert the Socialist Party, and that's really problematic for Pedro Sanchez going forward.
Lorenzo, is there a danger that we look at a country and we judge it by its GDP and the growth rate, and as we're hearing from Pablo, a lot of young Spanish people can't get a job, can't buy a house?
Yeah, I mean, this is a problem that is not just related to Spain. I mean, many countries in Europe have the same situation, and some countries like the UK and especially London have had this problem for many years. So I think it's a general problem. What we have seen is that increasingly some cities, some places that are particularly appealing either for jobs or because are touristic locations, have recorded quite a sharp rise in house prices. But sometimes the rest of the country is not as exposed to that, as to higher demand, and therefore house prices are still depressed. So sometimes it's a mixed picture within countries rather than among countries.
And Nina, it's interesting that to tackle the housing crisis, Pedro Sanchez has been looking at bringing in a tax on non-Spanish buyers. And it was a law that was phrased in such a way, it was basically aimed at English people, wasn't it?
Yeah, this has gotten a lot of the sort of Brexity press here in the UK really stoked up. You know, it's knocked the late Princess Diana off the front page of the Daily Express for once.
That never happens.
Which is very rare, actually. But it just goes to show how many British expats there are living in Spain who are quite concerned about their future. And the reason for this at the moment is also because Keir Starmer's Labour government here in the UK that hasn't really been in power for very long, is looking to tax people more and more, particularly if they want to buy property. And what they also want to do is sort of nullify that wealth gap between the generations as well. And a lot of the richer Brits, if they can, from the middle classes, try and retire to somewhere in the sun. And Spain has traditionally been the place for that.
Pablo, just to you on that issue, what was your reading of the property tax for foreigners, non-EU residents in Spain? I mean, clever move, got a lot of headlines, but is it going to work?
I don't think in its own it's going to work. I think, again, like many other things Pedro Sanchez does and essentially the government is trying to do, is trying to put forward a solution or a possible solution or something that may help ameliorate the situation. I think he has wide support across Spain because the feeling across Spain is that housing is a real problem. It's a real issue. And rightly or wrongly, a lot of people are blaming tourism and you know, the increase of immigration, that particular kind of immigration that is driving prices up, and particularly people from outside the European Union, in this case, obviously Britain, moving to certain parts of Spain and then making properties that are impossible and unattainable for most people, particularly young people. So I think it was a very clever political move. I don't think it's going to solve the housing crisis. At the end of the day, what you need to do is obviously build more houses, right? And that's complicated and complex, and it requires a lot of changes in the Spanish government as well, which are hard to implement because of the fact that it's a minority government. So within the confines of the political reality of the government, I think it was possibly everything, or as much as Pedro Sanchez can do at this moment in time. And I think it's very good as well, because I think even though some people in the opposition parties were complaining about it and were open arms about it, they don't seem to have an alternative plan on how to ameliorate Spain's housing crisis. So I think it was a good and clever political move, but it's not going to solve the housing crisis at all.
And Lorenzo, public spending is very high in Spain. Is that all part of the government strategy? You know, all this rivers of money sloshing about, let's spend some of it on big projects.
Well, Spain, in line with Italy, is helped a lot by European funds. Next Generation EU Recovery and Resilience Facility benefited Spain even more than Italy as a percentage of GDP. And Spain is putting this money to work, which is good for the economy. So public investment is rising. Now, public spending overall is rising as well, but Spain still has somewhat lower debt to GDP, so can still afford some extra spending. However, remember that the new fiscal framework in Europe requires countries to maintain a level of net spending aggregate in line with the European definition below a certain threshold, which is driven by debt sustainability. So I think Spain, in line with all other countries in the EU, will have to respect this requirement in the future. So cannot really spend or grow out of the problems or continue to maintain very high growth performance just by public spending.
Nina, what policies could other countries cherry pick that the Spanish have put in place to get this growth? I mean, the UK is screaming out for growth. Germany's in recession yet again. What do you think they could copy from the Spanish?
One of the things that Spain has been very able to do is build wind turbines, and wind turbines were one of the fulcrums of the German election debate. Remember the AfD going around in parts of East Germany, putting up billboards saying we don't want any more of these wind turbines. I think the energy frontier. Spain has its own geography where it has a lot of sunshine, it has a lot of land, it does have a lot of wind, it has, some plateaus at a higher altitudes, it works for them. But that has really been very, very helpful for Spain to try and disassociate itself from the spike in the oil and gas prices brought on by the Ukraine war. Portugal's done a very similar thing. In fact, actually, you could look at Iberia as a peninsula, and it has very similar sort of dynamics between what's happened in Portugal under Antonio Costa's recent government up until recently, and Pedro Sanchez is also a socialist minority government as well, doing very similar things in terms of tourism, in terms of infrastructure investment, and it has actually boosted the economy quite a bit in the short term. Big question, I suppose, is whether or not it's sustainable. But there are a lot of people, I can say, in Brussels who are quite sceptical about this, particularly in the business lobby, saying, well, no, what we really need is less regulation. We don't need rises in the minimum wage like Pedro Sanchez has been bringing about. That'll stimulate growth. It turns out that hasn't been the case, and Spain and Portugal are the classic examples of that.
Do you think they have to balance the whole tourism side of the economy as well? Because there is a backlash. A lot of people in certain towns and cities and the Canary Islands feel that they've had too many visitors.
I suppose the point I'd make is you've got to distinguish between two things. And I'm a born and bred Londoner, and London has faced some of these problems too. One is tourism that's transitory. Another issue is wealth tourism as well, which buys into expensive properties in places like Madrid and Barcelona, and also second homes in other parts of Spain, and just crowds out local communities. And just my perspective as a Londoner who has family in Lisbon that's been affected by this trend is that it utterly hollows out entire communities. Portugal has taken some laws to try and rein this in quite swiftly, actually. And so I suspect Spain might want to lead from the example there.
Pablo, we mentioned the phrase boom and bust earlier on. How long do you give it then? Should we be cynical here and think this is going to end in a few years' time, or is Spain now going gangbusters for the next few years?
Well, obviously, I don't know. That's the answer, right? I don't have a. If I knew exactly what was going to happen, I would tell everybody and collect my Nobel Prize in economics. But the history says in Spain, it's been traditionally a very boom and bust economy, particularly since the 60s. Now, I think the key difference here with the Spanish economy today is, as Nina was saying, that I think the key lesson here is that Spain has managed to diversify its economy more, and is more diverse economy, a more complex economy than perhaps it was 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, certainly 40 years ago. And it's not all about tourism. As in the good old days, it was all about construction and building. So tourism plays an important part, of course, but as Nina was saying, there's the development of clean energies and renewable energies, and that sector has grown considerably in Spain. Obviously, financial services, as we know, has been a strong point of Spanish economy for quite some time now. Investment in technology as well, investment from the government in big infrastructure projects. So there's been a bit more of diversification in the Spanish economy, which I believe is important. But at the same time, I think these rates of growth, even for a country like Spain, there's a certain ceiling. And the fact remains that tourism is a very important part of the equation. And tourism can be a very volatile industry. I don't expect a pandemic to happen anytime soon, or at least I hope not. But you never know what can happen, and all sorts of different things can have an impact in the tourism industry, which is a very volatile industry. So I don't think it's going to last forever. I would say we have to enjoy the ride and see where it takes us. But I'm thinking the Spanish economy today is perhaps a little bit more robust, more malleable, and more flexible than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago.
And Lorenzo, that's been a clever move, hasn't it? Diversifying so that not everything is all about tourism in Spain anymore.
Yeah, I totally agree. Although I think Spain, as well as Italy and other countries, need to invest more in technology, in jobs with high wages, because clearly tourism and other, sectors with low wages don't really help much the economy over the long run. These are not the high productivity, high total productivity sectors that countries really want to give a boost. So it's fine. It's good for employment. It's good to maintain good-looking country, but over the long run, I think you need to invest on technology. You also need to invest in high value-added industries.
Nina, just finally to you, I mean, every leader in Europe would look at what Pedro Sanchez has in his inbox and they'd probably happily swap places.
Well, except for some of the political headaches that he has, because I've been in EU circles chairing events with different parties and so on and so forth, and members of the Partido Popular are very vocal against some of their criticisms towards Pedro Sanchez, particularly governing with a minority government after the last election. So they wouldn't want any of those types of headaches. But economically, yes, it is doing well. Just picking up on something that Lorenzo was just saying before about investing in technology, that's going to be an interesting one on an EU-wide level, because we're seeing a chasm politically opening up between Donald Trump's administration, backed by a politicized Silicon Valley, and the European Union, now with the new German incoming chancellor, very much in a strident position, who are probably going to butt heads over the issue of technology. So if you want to invest in the tech space, you're probably going to be waiting a little bit, whether it's Spain or anywhere else, to find out who's going to blink first in that big multi-billion-dollar game of chicken.
Nina, thank you, and to Lorenzo and Pablo as well. Thank you both. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.